The Cold War is usually described as a period of tension that stopped short of actual war. That description is accurate in the narrowest technical sense and almost entirely misleading in every other way. What the historical record shows, particularly the portions of that record that spent decades in classified archives before being released in fragments, reviewed by researchers and quietly acknowledged by governments with minimal fanfare, is something considerably more disturbing than the phrase Cold War implies. It was not a war that remained cold because the two superpowers were restrained. It remained cold, if that word even applies, because of a series of coincidences, mechanical failures that happened to fail in the right direction, and individual decisions made by people who were never supposed to be making decisions at all. The systems that were built to manage nuclear conflict were not systems built for peace. They were systems built for war, and the fact that war did not come was not a product of their design. It was a product of their malfunction, their misuse, and the persistent human tendency to hesitate at the last possible moment before crossing a line that every institution around them had already crossed on paper. The 25 secrets that follow were not secrets in the conspiratorial sense. They were not hidden by shadowy figures in back rooms, though some of them passed through rooms that were never officially acknowledged to exist. They were hidden the way governments hide most things, through classification protocols, bureaucratic inertia, the slow accumulation of paperwork in filing systems that no one had time to review, and the institutional preference for not publicizing information that made the entire architecture of national security look like a structure held together with assumptions and hope. When those documents were eventually released through freedom of information requests, through the passage of mandatory declassification timelines, through the work of historians who spent careers filing requests and waiting years for responses, what they revealed was not a conspiracy. It was something harder to dismiss than a conspiracy because it was a system, and the system had been working exactly as designed, and the design had nearly killed everyone. The first thing that needs to be understood about the Cold War, before any of the specific incidents can be properly absorbed, is the baseline condition of both superpowers throughout the entire period. From roughly 1949 onward, when the Soviet Union successfully tested its first nuclear device and the American monopoly on atomic weapons ended permanently, both nations existed in a state that had no historical precedent. They had weapons capable of ending human civilization, and they had built institutional frameworks designed to use those weapons under conditions that were ambiguous, time-pressured, and frequently dependent on information that was incomplete, misread, or simply wrong. The decision to launch a nuclear strike was never going to be made with full information. Everyone involved in building the command and control systems for nuclear weapons understood this from the beginning. The question they were answering was not how to ensure that nuclear weapons would only be used when appropriate. The question they were answering was how to ensure that nuclear weapons could be used fast enough to be effective, and those are profoundly different questions. The first secret buried in the documents concerns something called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, a targeting document for American nuclear forces that was developed in the late 1950s and remained classified in its specifics for decades. When researchers finally gained access to portions of it, what they found was a plan of such comprehensive, destructive intent that even the military officials who reviewed early drafts were reportedly disturbed by its scale. The plan called for the simultaneous delivery of nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern European satellite states in a coordinated attack designed to destroy military capability, industrial infrastructure, and population centers in a single overwhelming strike. The casualty estimates that accompanied the plan were not approximations. They were detailed projections, broken down by region and yield and fallout patterns, and they reached into the hundreds of millions of deaths within the first phase of the attack alone. What made this document remarkable was not its existence, because some form of nuclear targeting plan was an obvious operational necessity. What made it remarkable was its scope and its assumptions. The plan was built on the premise that any major conflict with the Soviet Union would immediately and automatically escalate to full nuclear exchange, and therefore any serious military confrontation needed to begin with the full application of American nuclear force. The idea of limited nuclear options, of using a small number of weapons to signal resolve without triggering total war, was not a significant part of the original plan. The assumption was totality, and that assumption was baked into every layer of the operational architecture beneath it. The second document-buried reality concerns the degree to which the American nuclear arsenal was, for significant periods during the 1950s and early 1960s, far less secure than the public was ever informed. There is a category of nuclear weapons accident classified as a broken arrow, a military term for an incident involving nuclear weapons that does not result in nuclear detonation, but involves some combination of accidental launch, fire, theft, loss, or unauthorized use. The number of such incidents that occurred during the Cold War was not small. Declassified records eventually confirmed dozens of broken arrow events, ranging from aircraft crashes carrying nuclear weapons to a 1961 incident over Goldsboro, North Carolina, in which a B-52 bomber broke apart in flight and released 2 nuclear weapons. One of those weapons fell through the sequence of arming mechanisms in such a way that investigators later determined 5 of the 6 safety mechanisms had failed. A single switch, later described by researchers who reviewed the technical assessment as a simple low-voltage switch not designed with nuclear safety as its primary function, stood between the intact detonation of a multi-megaton nuclear device and the landscape of North Carolina. That account was classified. The public learned fragments of it over years of document releases. The full technical assessment of how close the weapon came to detonating was not publicly confirmed until decades later. The third secret in the documents relates to a phenomenon that military planners and arms control researchers eventually came to describe as the problem of delegation. From the earliest days of the nuclear era, there was a fundamental tension in American nuclear command authority. The president was the sole legal authority for ordering a nuclear strike, but the president could be killed, incapacitated, or simply unreachable in the opening minutes of a nuclear exchange. The communications systems that connected the president to the nuclear forces were targets themselves, among the highest priority targets in Soviet war planning. So the operational reality was that authority to use nuclear weapons had to be distributed downward through the chain of command to military commanders at various levels, who would have to make decisions if the top of the chain was severed. The documents that eventually emerged about this process revealed something that was never stated publicly during the Cold War and was acknowledged only slowly and obliquely afterward. At certain points and under certain documented conditions, the authority to initiate nuclear weapons use extended significantly further down the command chain than American strategic doctrine publicly acknowledged. Field commanders, under specific and documented alert conditions, had access to weapons and launch procedures that did not require confirmation from Washington. The precise extent of this authority varied over time and was a matter of considerable internal debate and revision. But the underlying reality was that the American nuclear arsenal was not, during the most dangerous periods of the Cold War, under the kind of centralized control that official statements suggested. The Soviet system had its own version of this problem, and the fourth secret in the documents concerns a project whose existence was not publicly confirmed by Russian authorities until the 1990s, and whose full technical details have never been officially disclosed. The system was called Perimeter, referred to in Western intelligence analysis by the name Dead Hand. It was a semi-automatic nuclear launch system designed to ensure that the Soviet Union could retaliate against a nuclear first strike, even if the entire Soviet leadership had been killed and all normal command communications had been destroyed. The system worked, in its general outline, by monitoring for the signatures of nuclear detonations on Soviet territory, cross-referencing those signatures with communication signals from the leadership, and, if it detected evidence of a nuclear attack with no corresponding communication from surviving leadership, initiating the launch sequence for a significant portion of the Soviet nuclear arsenal through automated command signals. Human beings were involved in the system, at least in some versions of the design, but the humans involved were isolated from the outside world, sealed in hardened bunkers, with authority to complete a launch sequence under conditions where they would have no ability to verify what was happening outside, no ability to communicate with anyone outside the system, and no established procedure for refusing to complete the sequence if the automated indicators said the conditions for launch had been met. The system was operational. Russian officials confirmed its existence and stated that it remains operational in some form to this day. The Cold War ended. Dead Hand did not. The fifth entry from the classified record concerns a crisis that receives substantial historical attention, but whose most dangerous internal dimension remained classified for years. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 is typically framed as a 13-day confrontation between Kennedy and Khrushchev that was resolved through diplomacy and mutual restraint. That framing is not wrong, but it is substantially incomplete. What the documents reveal, including Soviet naval records that were not shared with Western researchers until a conference in Havana in 2002, is that the crisis came far closer to nuclear exchange than either government acknowledged at the time or for decades afterward. A Soviet submarine, designated B-59, was operating in the Caribbean during the height of the crisis. It had been out of communication with Moscow for days. Its crew did not know whether war had already begun. The submarine carried a nuclear torpedo with a yield estimated at roughly 10 kilotons that its commander had authority to fire under certain defined conditions. The submarine was located by American destroyers and subjected to signaling depth charges, small explosive charges meant to force the submarine to surface, a procedure that was communicated to the Soviets through diplomatic back channels, but that information had not reached the crew of B-59. The captain of the submarine, Valentin Savitsky, believed he was under attack. He believed war had started. He gave the order to prepare the nuclear torpedo for firing. Under the command protocols of the Soviet submarine fleet at that time, firing the weapon required agreement from 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander Vasily Arkhipov, who happened to be aboard B-59. Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch. He argued for surfacing instead. After a confrontation that lasted a period described by surviving crew members as extremely tense, Savitsky agreed. The submarine surfaced. The crisis continued for several more days before its resolution. Vasily Arkhipov's name was not publicly associated with this moment for many years. His role in it was not confirmed from Soviet records until long after his death. The sixth document, Concealed Reality, concerns the operational security of Soviet nuclear forces during a period that received almost no public attention at the time, and relatively little even afterward. In the early 1980s, the Reagan administration pursued a strategy of psychological pressure against the Soviet Union that included, among other elements, a series of naval exercises and intelligence operations designed to probe Soviet defenses, test Soviet response times, and demonstrate American capability to approach Soviet territory without detection. These operations were classified, and their full scope was not publicly confirmed until the 1990s. What the documents eventually revealed was that these operations had a profound and destabilizing effect on Soviet military and political leadership that Western planners either did not fully anticipate or chose to discount. The Soviet leadership under Yuri Andropov, who was in deteriorating health and deeply suspicious of American intentions, interpreted the pattern of American military activity as potentially preparatory to a first strike. The KGB was tasked with a special intelligence collection program designated Ryan, whose explicit purpose was to detect indicators of American preparations for a nuclear first strike. The indicators the KGB was told to watch for included things like changes in working hours at government buildings, purchases of blood supplies by military hospitals, and movement of senior government officials to hardened facilities. The program was based on a genuine belief at the highest levels of Soviet leadership that the United States was preparing for war. and it shaped Soviet military posture in ways that increased the risk of a catastrophic misreading of American actions. The seventh secret from the files reaches directly into the most dangerous moment of that entire period, an event now referred to as Able Archer 83. In November 1983, NATO conducted a command post exercise simulating the transition from conventional to nuclear war in Europe. The exercise was more realistic than previous iterations. It used actual message formats that would be used in a real nuclear release sequence. It involved radio silence periods that Soviet intelligence interpreted as consistent with preparations for actual operations rather than exercises. Senior political figures participated in ways that had not been typical of previous exercises. Soviet intelligence, already primed by the Ryan collection effort to look for signs of attack preparation, interpreted the exercise as potentially being cover for an actual first strike. Soviet nuclear forces in Europe were placed on a heightened alert status. Some Soviet aircraft were loaded with nuclear weapons and kept at readiness. The communication traffic that accompanied these preparations was detected by Western intelligence, and a small number of analysts recognized what was happening and conveyed their concern upward through intelligence channels. The documents that eventually described this period, including a CIA assessment from 1990 that was itself classified for years, concluded that the danger during Able Archer 83 had been real, that Soviet forces had genuinely moved toward increased readiness in a way that reflected a belief that war might be imminent, and that NATO had come uncomfortably close to triggering the exact response it was simulating. The exercise ended without incident. NATO did not know during the exercise how close Soviet forces had come to responding as though it were not an exercise. The eighth entry concerns the technical vulnerabilities in American early warning systems, which produced false alerts of incoming Soviet missiles, with a frequency that was not disclosed to the public. The most extensively documented of these false alerts occurred in November 1979 and June 1980. The 1979 incident involved the inadvertent loading of a training tape, a simulation of a Soviet nuclear attack, into the operational computers of the American early warning system. For approximately 6 minutes, the system indicated to personnel at NORAD, the Strategic Air Command, and the National Security Council that the United States was under attack. Interceptor aircraft were launched. The airborne command post, the aircraft carrying the command and control equipment that would be used to manage nuclear war if ground facilities were destroyed, was in the air within minutes. The president was not notified. Duty officers worked to verify the attack through other sensors, found no confirmation, and the alert was terminated before any irreversible action was taken. The 1980 incidents, which occurred multiple times over a period of days due to a faulty computer chip that was eventually identified and replaced, produced similar alert sequences. Each time, the system indicated incoming Soviet missiles, crews moved toward launch readiness, and the alert was terminated when cross-verification with other sensors showed no actual launches. The chip that caused the 1980 false alerts cost 46 cents. The ninth secret in the documents concerns the people who operated at the terminal end of the nuclear weapon system, the crews who maintained and could launch the missiles, and what the institutional record reveals about the reliability of that human element. Programs designed to assess the psychological fitness of nuclear weapons operators existed throughout the Cold War, and produced findings that were carefully managed within the military institutional structure. What declassified records eventually showed was that the rate of personnel removal from nuclear duties for reliability concerns, including mental health issues, substance abuse, and disciplinary problems, was not negligible. Studies conducted within the Air Force during the 1970s and 1980s found that a consistent percentage of personnel assigned to missile launch duties showed indicators of stress, psychological strain, or behavioral problems that would have disqualified them from other sensitive duties. The institutional response was complex because acknowledging the problem too openly risked undermining confidence in the reliability of the deterrent, while not addressing it risked operational failures of a different kind. The records show ongoing internal tension about how to balance these concerns without resolving them in any fundamental way. The 10th document, Buried Reality, involves the Soviet early warning system and a specific incident that came to public attention only in 1998, more than 15 years after it occurred. On September 26, 1983, roughly 5 weeks before the Able Archer exercise, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov was serving as the duty officer at Serpukhov 15, a facility responsible for monitoring satellite data for indications of American missile launches. The system registered a launch, then another. The computer system classified the alert as having the highest possible confidence level and indicated that 5 American Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles had been launched toward the Soviet Union. Petrov's duty was to report the alert up the chain of command as an attack, which would have initiated a response sequence that could have led to Soviet launch under the compressed timeline that Soviet war plans allowed for decision-making. Petrov did not report it as an attack. He classified it as a false alarm in his log and reported his suspicion based on reasoning that included the small number of missiles detected, the fact that a genuine American first strike would have involved hundreds of missiles, and the fact that the satellite data seemed to lack corroborating signals from ground-based radar, which should have confirmed the launches independently. His assessment was correct. The alert had been caused by a rare alignment of sunlight reflecting off clouds in a way that the satellite system had misinterpreted as missile launch signatures. The system had never encountered this condition before. Petrov was not decorated for his decision. He was reprimanded for improper record-keeping related to the incident. His name entered the public record only after he spoke to a journalist years later. The 11th secret concerns the nuclear weapons that the United States deployed in Europe and the command and control arrangements that governed them, which were considerably more fragmented and delegation-dependent than official doctrine acknowledged. American tactical nuclear weapons, shorter-range weapons designed for battlefield use in a European conflict, were deployed at dozens of locations across Western Europe throughout the Cold War, in the custody of units from multiple nations under NATO command arrangements that involved complex questions about who had authority to use them and under what conditions. The documents that illuminate this period show a persistent tension between the operational need to have these weapons ready for quick use and the political and safety need to maintain firm control over them. What the records reveal is that during certain alert conditions, the custody arrangements for these weapons created situations where their security was significantly less certain than official statements indicated. The question of whether allied nations, under extreme pressure in a conventional conflict, might make independent decisions about nuclear weapons in their custody was never fully resolved at the institutional level, and the documents that address it show awareness of the problem without resolution of it. The 12th document, Concealed Reality, concerns a category of nuclear weapons accident that has received less historical attention than the dropped bombs and crashed aircraft. During the 1950s and early 1960s, the United States lost several nuclear weapons that were never recovered. The term used internally was broken arrow, but a subset of these incidents involved weapons that went to the bottom of the ocean or were otherwise unrecovered and remain missing. The most extensively documented of these involves a hydrogen bomb that was lost in the waters off the coast of Tybee Island, Georgia, in 1958 after a collision between a B-47 bomber and an F-86 fighter during a training exercise. The bomb was jettisoned by the crew to save the aircraft, fell into approximately 15 feet of water and several feet of silt, and despite extensive search operations was never located. The military eventually concluded that the bomb, while complete, lacked the plutonium component that would allow a nuclear detonation and therefore did not represent a nuclear safety risk. That assessment was itself classified, and the public accounting of the incident evolved over decades of document releases. The bomb remains in the water off the Georgia coast. This is confirmed. It is not disputed. It simply remains there, because the cost and difficulty of recovering it were judged to outweigh the risk of leaving it. The 13th secret in the files concerns the extent and methodology of Soviet espionage against the American nuclear program, not the early atomic espionage that produced figures like Klaus Fuchs and Julius Rosenberg, which became publicly known through trial and prosecution, but the sustained, institutionalized intelligence collection effort that continued for decades afterward. Documents released from Soviet archives and from American counterintelligence files, as well as the Venona decryptions of Soviet intelligence traffic, reveal a collection effort against American nuclear programs that was more extensive, more technically sophisticated, and more successful than was publicly acknowledged during the period when it was occurring. The practical consequence of this collection was not simply that the Soviets gained information. The practical consequence was that Soviet weapons development was accelerated, that certain American technological advantages were shorter-lived than American planners calculated, and that the strategic balance shifted more rapidly than American assessments anticipated at several critical points. The documents that describe this are not simply accounts of espionage. They are accounts of how the nuclear competition between the superpowers was shaped by information asymmetries that were themselves the product of successful intelligence operations, and how the strategies built on assumptions about the other side's capabilities were often built on incorrect foundations. The 14th entry from the classified record addresses a dimension of nuclear strategy that was explicitly kept from public discussion throughout the Cold War, and has received only limited acknowledgement since. The concept of launch on warning, which refers to a posture in which nuclear forces would be launched upon receiving sensor indication of incoming enemy missiles, without waiting for those missiles to actually detonate, was a policy option that was debated, adopted in various forms, and built into operational planning in ways that shortened the decision timeline for nuclear use to minutes. The specific parameters of launch on warning policies, the sensor thresholds, the decision procedures, the degree to which human judgment was preserved at each stage were classified. What the documents eventually revealed was that during certain alert conditions, particularly during periods of heightened tension, American nuclear forces were postured in ways that reduced the decision timeline to a point where meaningful human deliberation was, in practical terms, nearly impossible. The sequence from sensor alert to launch authorization to actual launch involved multiple steps, each of which had time constraints imposed by the strategic logic of the situation, and the cumulative effect of those constraints was that the human at the end of the sequence was not making a decision in any meaningful sense. The human was completing a procedure that the system had already determined should be completed. The 15th secret concerns the role of American intelligence assessments in shaping the nuclear competition, and specifically the phenomenon that came to be known as the missile gap. In the late 1950s, American intelligence assessments concluded that the Soviet Union was producing intercontinental ballistic missiles at a rate that would soon give it a significant numerical advantage over American forces. This assessment was used to justify accelerated American missile production and was a significant political issue in the 1960 presidential election. When reconnaissance satellite imagery became available in sufficient quantity to accurately assess actual Soviet missile deployments, the intelligence community discovered that the missile gap did not exist in the direction that had been feared. The Soviets had far fewer intercontinental ballistic missiles than American estimates had projected. The American response to the missile gap that did not exist had, however, produced a genuine American numerical advantage in missiles that now shaped Soviet strategic planning. The political and military decisions made in response to a threat that intelligence had fundamentally mischaracterized had created a different strategic reality. And the documents that trace this sequence are a record of how deeply consequential institutional error can be when the institutional error concerns weapons of existential consequence. The 16th document, Buried Reality, concerns the nuclear weapons programs of nations beyond the two superpowers, and specifically what American and Soviet intelligence knew about the development of nuclear weapons by other countries, and what decisions were made about that knowledge. China's nuclear weapons development was monitored by American intelligence, and the documents that describe the internal deliberations about how to respond include options that were seriously considered and then set aside rather than rejected on principle. The option of a preemptive military strike against Chinese nuclear facilities was considered by the Johnson administration in the early 1960s, with discussion that extended to seeking Soviet cooperation or at minimum Soviet acquiescence in such an operation. The documents that describe this period show a consideration of preventive military action against another country's nuclear program that was conducted seriously, with detailed analysis, before being concluded to be impractical rather than impermissible. The distinction matters because impractical circumstances can change in ways that impermissible ones cannot. The 17th secret in the documents involves the biological and chemical weapons programs maintained by both superpowers, programs that existed alongside and in many ways mirrored the nuclear competition. The Soviet biological weapons program, known to have been significantly larger and more advanced than publicly acknowledged during the Cold War, was the subject of a treaty commitment that the Soviet Union signed in 1972 and then systematically violated through a massive covert research and production program. Documents and testimony that emerged after the Soviet collapse, including from defectors who had worked within the program, revealed that the Soviets had developed biological weapons agents of extraordinary lethality and had maintained production capabilities on an industrial scale, all while officially committing to the Biological Weapons Convention. The American side of this equation is also documented in ways that complicate simple narratives. American biological weapons programs were officially terminated by presidential order in 1969 and 1970, and stockpiles were destroyed. But the documents that describe the termination process and the subsequent monitoring of what replaced those programs show a period of significant institutional uncertainty about what was being preserved under the rubric of defensive research and what that distinction meant in operational terms. The 18th entry from the classified record concerns the technical vulnerabilities of the systems designed to prevent unauthorized or accidental nuclear use, which were, for significant portions of the early Cold War, considerably less robust than the public was told. Permissive action links, electronic locks designed to prevent nuclear weapons from being armed without authorization codes, were not universally installed on American nuclear weapons in the early years of the nuclear arsenal. The documents that describe the institutional resistance to installing these safety devices within the military establishment reveal an argument that was made, sincerely and within the official record, that safety devices which required codes from the civilian chain of command would slow the response time of nuclear forces and therefore undermine deterrence. This argument was accepted at an institutional level for a period of years. Some American nuclear weapons were deployed without the electronic locks that would have prevented unauthorized use, not because no one had thought of the concept, but because military commanders had successfully argued against the requirement on operational grounds. The period during which these conditions existed, and the degree to which the weapons could have been armed and potentially used without presidential authorization during that period, remained classified for decades and was acknowledged only gradually and incompletely in the public record. The 19th secret concerns the nuclear weapons testing programs of both superpowers. Not the tests themselves, which were publicly announced, but the health and environmental consequences of those tests, which were managed administratively in ways that were deliberately designed to limit public awareness. American nuclear testing in Nevada and in the Pacific produced fallout exposures for both military personnel and civilian populations that were known to the testing authorities to carry health risks that were not disclosed. Documents obtained through litigation and freedom of information requests, as well as the work of congressional investigations in the 1970s and 1980s, revealed internal assessments of fallout exposure and health risk that were significantly more detailed and more alarming than the public statements made at the time. Military personnel who participated in nuclear tests, positioned near blast sites to test human responses and equipment performance under nuclear conditions, were exposed to radiation levels that the testing authorities' own documents showed were above thresholds that the same authorities were publicly citing as safe for other purposes. Downwind civilian communities received fallout exposures that were monitored, documented, and not publicly disclosed. The documents that reveal this are not marginal records. They are the official institutional record of a decision made at the highest levels of the testing program to manage information about health risk as a matter of operational security and public confidence maintenance. The 20th document buried reality concerns the human geography of the nuclear competition, the people who lived in the communities built around nuclear weapons production, and the systematic concealment of what those communities were being exposed to. The Hanford site in Washington State, the Rocky Flats plant in Colorado, the Savannah River site in South Carolina, and dozens of other facilities in the American nuclear weapons production complex generated radioactive and chemical waste that was released into the environment, into groundwater, into the air, and into the bodies of workers and nearby residents at levels and in patterns that were documented internally and not disclosed publicly. The Soviet nuclear production complex generated equivalent, and in some cases worse, exposures at facilities including Mayak in the southern Urals, where a 1957 explosion at a nuclear waste storage facility released a radioactive plume across a significant area of the Ural region in an event that was completely suppressed within the Soviet Union and not publicly acknowledged by the Soviet government until 1989. The Kishtim disaster, as it came to be called in the Western literature that emerged when intelligence agencies pieced it together from indirect evidence, was a major nuclear accident that occurred 2 years before the much better-known accident at the Windscale reactor in Britain and 4 years before the American SL-1 reactor accident, and it remained entirely outside the public record within the Soviet Union for more than 3 decades. The 21st secret in the files addresses the military planning for nuclear war in Europe and what those plans required of the countries that would have been the battlefield. American and NATO nuclear war plans for the European theater involved the use of nuclear weapons on European soil against Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces, in quantities and at locations that would have produced catastrophic consequences for the populations of the countries being defended. The documents that described these plans, including German records that became accessible after reunification, reveal that the West German government was aware that NATO nuclear war plans involved the detonation of multiple nuclear weapons on West German territory as part of the defensive strategy. The political management of this reality required maintaining public support for a defense strategy whose operational details, if fully understood by the populations they were designed to protect, would likely have generated profound political opposition. The documents show awareness of this tension, and they show the institutional management of it, but they do not show resolution of it. The plans remained in place, the information management remained in place. Both continued until the strategic situation that justified them changed. The 22nd document concealed reality concerns the intelligence collection methods used by both superpowers and the degree to which those methods, when they failed or were compromised, shaped the strategic assessments that drove weapons development and deployment. The American U-2 reconnaissance program, which produced the imagery that resolved the missile gap question, was itself a source of strategic risk that was managed through a combination of optimism and classified briefings to a small number of officials. When Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union in May 1960, the event destroyed a summit meeting between Eisenhower and Khrushchev that had been intended to reduce Cold War tensions, and it revealed to the Soviets that American reconnaissance overflights had been ongoing for years. The institutional response to this event, including the cover story about a weather aircraft that the Eisenhower administration attempted to maintain before the Soviets produced Powers alive, is extensively documented. Less extensively documented in the public record, though present in the classified files, is the assessment of how much the U-2 overflights had actually revealed to Soviet intelligence about American reconnaissance priorities and the gaps in American knowledge that those priorities implied. The 23rd secret concerns the role of nuclear weapons in conflicts beyond the central US-Soviet confrontation, specifically the extent to which nuclear weapons were introduced into regional conflicts during the Cold War as policy options that were seriously considered at the highest levels of government. The Korean War produced internal deliberations about nuclear weapons use that were not limited to vague consideration. Documents from the Truman administration show specific planning discussions about the tactical use of nuclear weapons in Korea, including target lists and delivery assessments. The Eisenhower administration considered nuclear weapons use in connection with the defense of offshore islands held by the Republic of China in the 1950s. The Nixon administration, according to documents that emerged decades later, conducted planning under a deliberate policy of ambiguity designed to leave adversaries uncertain whether nuclear weapons might be used in connection with the Vietnam War. Each of these episodes was managed through a combination of internal deliberation and public silence, with the institutional record showing considerations that the public record of the time never reflected. The 24th entry from the classified record concerns the end period of the Cold War and a specific vulnerability in Soviet early warning and command and control systems that was known to American intelligence and was not publicly acknowledged. As the Soviet Union's economic and institutional capacity declined through the 1980s, the maintenance and reliability of Soviet nuclear command and control systems degraded in ways that American intelligence assessed with increasing concern. The concern was not that degraded Soviet systems would make a Soviet first strike more likely. The concern was that degraded systems increased the probability of unauthorized use, false alerts, or accidental launch from the Soviet side, and that managing this risk required communicating with Soviet military and political leadership through channels that themselves carried risks. The documents that describe this period show an American intelligence community that understood the Soviet nuclear apparatus was under strain in ways that made it less predictable, while simultaneously understanding that the Soviet leadership was unlikely to acknowledge or discuss these vulnerabilities in any forum where the United States could assess them clearly. The end of the Cold War resolved the immediate political confrontation. It did not produce a systematic resolution of the command and control vulnerabilities that the terminal period of the Soviet Union had created, because the successor states to the Soviet Union inherited weapons, facilities, and institutional frameworks in conditions that the Soviet state had not had the capacity to maintain, and that the successor states initially had even less capacity to address. The 25th and final secret in the documents is not a single event or a specific incident. It is a structural reality that the full body of Cold War documentation reveals when it is read not for individual revelations, but for the pattern that runs through all of them. Throughout the entire Cold War, from the development of the first Soviet nuclear device through the collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent period of disorganized transition, the nuclear arsenals of both superpowers were managed by institutional systems that were designed with a primary emphasis on their ability to function under attack, on their survivability and their capacity for use, and with a secondary emphasis, always secondary, on the mechanisms that would prevent their use in circumstances that were ambiguous, mistaken, or driven by system malfunction rather than human decision. The safety systems, the permissive action links, the dual key procedures, the psychological screening, the communications protocols, the verification systems for early warning alerts, all of these were improvements over what had existed before them, and all of them were added in response to failures and near failures and recognized vulnerabilities. And all of them were, by the testimony of the documents themselves, less comprehensive, less robust, and less reliable than the public statements about them suggested. The Cold War ended when the Soviet Union dissolved, and the political confrontation that had organized the nuclear competition lost its original structure. The weapons remained. The command systems remained. The targeting plans were revised, but the fundamental architecture remained. The institutional frameworks that had been built to manage nuclear weapons under conditions of active superpower rivalry were adapted to the new political situation, but they were not replaced. because replacing them would have required answering questions about what nuclear weapons are for and under what conditions their use would be legitimate that no government with nuclear weapons has been willing to answer publicly and on the record. The Cold War ended. The systems it built did not end with it. They persisted, as systems do, outlasting the conditions that justified their creation, maintained by the institutional logic that had always governed them, which was not the logic of peace, and was not the logic of restraint, but was the logic of readiness, which means they remain as they were throughout the period these documents describe, precisely and completely prepared to do what they were built to do.